What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Larry Rifkin and John Kropsic with you on America Trends podcast, and thanks so much for your listenership as we continue to grow our audience. And the only reason we are able to do that is because we've kind of locked into some of the topics that perhaps others are avoiding these days or just not focused on, John. And it's not because they don't know that things like this are going on, but perhaps some of our topics require just a little bit more thought and are a little bit off the path of the daily news cycle.
That's right. They got to look over the horizon.
Yes, because this is where the future has arrived. It's just in time. John loves that. You got to see the smile on this guy's face. It's wonderful, and it's wonderful working with him, and wonderful sharing all of the things that we acquire here.
We get some great guests, and I've said this before. I always learn something when I do these podcasts, and I even listen to them after I learn something. So it's amazing.
Well, I love the guy that we're bringing to you in just a moment. We did that episode on the public lands and the future use of those public lands. And we thought when, in fact, we read about the Resilient Forest Act of 2017. John, you read the entire bill, didn't you? Or you wrote the entire bill.
That's right. It's very resilient.
You wrote it on the back of a napkin. No, but it's like so many of these acts that go in front of Congress that it actually means whatever it says, it's the exact opposite.
Yes. Yeah. It just gives you that. Yeah, this is good. Let's vote for it.
Well, if you've been reading, folks, about all these wildfires, and it's hard not to read about them, some of them are just horrible in terms of the impact on homes and communities. But we're talking about within the natural life of America. Wildfires, are they good or are they bad?
Well, I mean, they could have been prevented if they proper burning, because the forest needs that, of course, as he'll say that. And I've seen it when I was a firefighter. Naugatuck Forest had a big fire when we were on one time. He came back a year later, and it was gorgeous. You know, I mean, the forests need that.
Well, I learned a lot when we talked to Dr. Chad Hanson, and that's who we'll be bringing to you in this podcast. He is a forest fire ecologist from the John Muir Earth Island Institute. And John Muir, of course, was a great environmentalist, and so people will recognize that name. But Dr. Hanson really lays it out in terms that we can all understand. And, John, I never really thought about how many species, animals and plant, really thrive in these burned environments and need that type of replenishment in a very natural form.
Well, I knew the trees. I didn't know so many species of animals needed it. I knew they were talking about in Yellowstone, there's a certain kind of evergreen that it won't reproduce unless there's a fire. You know?
And so this is a natural course of events. And what has man done to limit the impact as we have developed our homes and our communities around these natural lands? And I think what he's trying to say to us is, look, we don't have to give it all up to the logging interests in America, which basically the Resilient Forest Act of 2017 does.
Right.
There are defensible perimeters, and there are things that we can do in a much more limited fashion than trying to disrupt this natural order.
As a matter of fact, we should write our congressmen and senators and make sure they don't pass that act.
Yeah, exactly.
I think he gives us the numbers.
Well, I think, he gives us all of that information. Because, and John, I don't think there's only one. I think there's a couple of bills floating around
Well, that's
out
I
there.
think there's one in Congress and one in the Senate. I think there's two separate bills, I think.
Exactly.
I mean, this is craziness.
No, it is. But again, it's built on commercialism. It's built on the fact that man wants to control and dominate. And there are certain things best left alone.
Right. I agree with you.
And so that's what we're going to be talking about. And he is great. I mean, he really is. He talks about these forests and these animals, how they need forest fires. So Smokey the Bear, take that, Smokey. Now, look, this is not to be confused with the fact that you may be reading that there are these national park icons threatened by these winds that then frenzy these wildfires. And we're talking about Glacier Park and Yosemite and other sites that are facing certain destruction. We're not really talking about that. We're talking about the great wide open.
But maybe we are, because, over time, all that dead stuff gets on the floor of the forest, and without a way to get rid of it, it builds up, and that's why the fires are so big. So maybe we are talking about them a little bit.
Well, we are, I guess, in a sense, and maybe we're talking about a larger environmental and ecological issue, which is that you've got these wind-driven fires with these high temperatures, dry conditions, and so we've got to look at the whole balance that we've got in our environmental mode today and figure out what is causing that, because we've developed so much land, and even land that we think is still being preserved, it's still developed in many ways so that we can go and walk the trails and look at the habitat and the plant life. So we've got to figure out this balance so we can still enjoy these things and not feel endangered, but not also try to control so much of this natural environment that is beyond our reasoning and is left best in the Lord's hands, if you will. So we're going to talk about the current logging bill with Dr. Hanson, and it is said to fight forest fires, but he says, and he says it very clearly, that this is really destructive legislation. He pulls no punches, John.
No, well, they go down. I guess the idea is you take down trees to put a fire block in, but they're logging. I mean, there's no two ways about it.
So people may ask, John, what's more effective than that? Is there anything that we can do? And he helps us with that. Yep. He helps us understand what we can do to create these defensible perimeters around our houses without taking down a forest, if you will, before its time and letting the natural order take effect. Let's talk to Dr. Hanson. He's so knowledgeable and so easily understood in this realm. Well, it is our pleasure to have Dr. Chad Hanson with us. He is a forest fire ecologist from the Earth Island Institute. Explain what a forest fire ecologist is.
Well, I study a few things. One of the key things that I do research on is different wildlife species that actually depend on post-fire habitat, areas that have burned in forest fires. And there's actually quite a lot of them, surprisingly. I think most people don't realize that there are a lot of different wildlife species that have evolved over millennia to depend on either the dead trees, what we call snags, created by fire, or the different plants that tend to germinate after fire, especially intense fire, a lot of flowering plants.
And when we look at forest fires, I think a lot of us are a little bit confused because we do hear on the one hand that it's a part of the natural course of events, it's important, and yet on the other hand we see people feeling that national park icons are being threatened by a lot of wind and frenzy as it relates to wildfires. What should we be thinking about in terms of wildfire when we hear that term?
Right. It really comes down to how much we have. And what a lot of people don't realize, and this is what a lot of the science is showing us, and this is something I do research on as well. I do research on fire history, how fires burned in the past before we started putting out fires. And what researchers have found, myself included, is that we have less fire of all intensities now than we did naturally, historically, before fire suppression policies. So we actually have a deficit of that post-fire habitat, that unique habitat type that can only be created by fire for certain species. In some cases, is also created by drought and these native bark beetles. Basically, areas where you have mostly standing dead trees and that unique plant community that comes in after the forest canopy has been killed by drought or fire. We actually have less of that now than we had historically, and that's important because in order to maintain the full range of native biodiversity, all the different wildlife species that live in these forests, in other words, in order to have ecologically healthy forests, We want these natural disturbance processes to be within the natural range of variability. We don't want too little and we don't want too much. I think most people believe, and this is not the case, but I think there's a widespread belief out there, that we have too much fire in our forests. In reality, we actually have too little, and that has consequences too. So I think when we think about fire in our forests, we need to think about it within context, that we want these things to be operating in natural levels. But right now, the biggest concern is we just have too little.
And generally, how do these forest fires start? I know we hear these cases, and particularly in parched places like California at times, where there might be arson or there might be other things that set these fires off. But in general, what causes the forest fire generally?
In higher elevation mountain areas, in the mountain forest, it's mostly lightning. Now, in certain areas, low elevation areas in valleys and in foothills, especially near population centers, unsurprisingly, the majority of the ignitions in those areas, especially in the chaparral areas of Southern California, that's mostly from humans. There's just so many people doing lots of things that unintentionally cause sparks, and sometimes it is arson too. But most of the time, for the human ignitions, it's just people, making mistakes, causing sparks with equipment and various things. But in the higher elevation and more remote mountain forests, it's mostly lightning, and that's the way it's always been. And so basically the way this works is you get a summer lightning storm, usually associated with some rain, and lightning strikes cause an ignition, and that fire sort of creeps along, and they move very slowly at first. But when the fire weather changes, and by that I mean sort of hot, dry, windy conditions, once you get those sorts of conditions a couple weeks later, then all of a sudden that fire is going to start moving faster, and you're going to get a mix of fire intensities. Areas where it burns more lightly and just kind of creeps along the ground and consumes some pine needles and small trees, and areas where it burns hot and kills most or all the trees and goes up into the forest crown. All of that's natural. Historically, we always had a mix of fire intensities in these forests, and we need that because there are different wildlife species that depend on different fire intensities.
Have we had policies related to forest fires in terms of understanding them, the implications, what comes after, the importance of their replenishment in terms of what wildlife and what plant species require that kind of charring in order to grow? I mean, have we really had a lot of policy directives in this realm?
No, we don't. And this is one of the problems, is that a large portion of what we know now about the ecological importance of fire in our forests and the importance of post-fire habitat has been discovered in the last 15 years.
Really? So just the last 15 years?
Yeah.
Is that because it just hasn't been studied enough, or there aren't enough forest fire ecologists such as yourself?
I think that's part of it. I think that, before, historically, really all the way until the 1990s, late 1990s, there was this sort of view that we know that fire's bad in forests, and the focus was on putting fires out and trying to stop fire, at least high-intensity fire. And a lot of these areas were logged after fires, and so there was really no potential to study them because whatever was going on there naturally after a fire had been completely muddled and destroyed by logging practices after these fires. And so that began to change in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and basically what that did is it created natural laboratories, in a sense. Some environmental groups started raising questions about this, started filing lawsuits and protecting some of these areas. Some of those lawsuits were successful, quite a number of them were. And so scientists actually had areas that they could go in and study, and I had areas that I could study. So I've spent most of the last 15 years in my research hiking around these areas where fire burned through, especially where it burned through hot and created this unique habitat that we call snag forest habitat. And that's where I do my research, and studying species like the blackback woodpecker, for example, that depends on these big patches where fire kills most or all the trees, because that's the only place that they have enough food and homes to survive. But that really wasn't the potential. There wasn't potential for that years ago because people weren't really focused on it. They didn't really have that kind of intellectual curiosity about these areas, and because mostly we didn't have areas to study because they were getting logged so quickly.
And now, of course, you say, well, there is an attempt by Congress to deal with policy related to this issue, and it's called the Resilient Forest Act of 2017. You suggest that that's a rather misleading title.
Yes, it's highly misleading. The Resilient Federal Forest Act of 2017, it's H.R. 2936. This is a bill promoted by Congressman Bruce Westerman, a Republican from Arkansas, who comes from a logging background, and Congressman Westerman, who's one of the largest recipients of logging industry campaign contributions in Congress, has promoted this bill, which would essentially eliminate environmental analysis and public participation for nearly all logging projects on national forests and other federal public lands nationwide. And basically...
Wait a minute. What does that mean? It sounds like a blank check. Can they just go in and start cutting? What is it that would allow?
Well, there would be just a very, very perfunctory sort of process. Public notice is about it, but there wouldn't be any description of the project of any significance. You wouldn't even get to know what species were being impacted, how they would be impacted. At most, you might have a map and a very, very short period of time to comment, but you wouldn't even necessarily know what you're commenting on. And then they would issue a decision and they would start logging. Right now, you actually have the laws right now are not adequate. I will say that candidly. They're not adequate.
But this reverses even those which may not provide all the protections itself. This would make it worse.
This would make it far worse. Basically, it's sort of a giveaway of our federal public lands to the logging industry. I mean, essentially, that's what it is. It's the single most extreme attack on federal environmental laws governing our federal public lands, our national forests, and other federal lands that I've seen in my entire lifetime. I've never seen anything like it.
Wait, say that one more time, because that is quite a statement you made, and explain, that against the backdrop of other things that you have seen attempted in the past.
Right. Yeah, I will. I'll put a fine point on it. This is the most extreme attack on environmental laws on national forests that I've seen in my lifetime. This is a dramatic attempt to roll back and eliminate environmental analysis and public participation and really enforcement of any federal environmental laws on national forests. So let me just give you a rundown of what this Westerman bill, this H.R. 2936, proposes. And by the way, there's a Senate version that is different in some respects, but largely tries to accomplish the same thing, and that's S 1731 from Senator Thune, Republican from South Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the bottom line, is that number one, the legislation, they propose to allow these logging projects with virtually no environmental analysis of impacts or disclosure of adverse effects for logging projects, individual logging projects, up to 15 square miles in size each with no limit. And in some cases, many cases, in fact, up to 50 square miles in size each. This could be clear cuts in old-growth forests. These could be clear cuts in vital post-fire habitat and blackback woodpecker habitat, with essentially no public participation and no analysis or disclosure of adverse impacts on wildlife, on water, on soils, on anything. And for me, it really is sort of an attempt to turn over our national forests, in my perspective, to the timber industry and really just cut the American people out of the equation. And this is, one of the things that's wonderful about our national forests and federal public lands is that every citizen in this country, whether you live in rural America or suburban or urban America, every citizen is equally entitled to enjoy our federal public lands. Every citizen has an equal stake. And essentially what this bill would do is reverse that and say, no, these are not really federal public lands. These are really lands for local logging companies.
That is a dramatic statement. It really is. When we look now at forest fires and the federal or state role currently, what do they do in terms of suppression? Or do they just encourage, local officials and others to let it burn out? What is the suppression policy that we now have?
Right. I mean, you asked earlier also about, basically forest management and fire suppression and how are current policies related to this enormous surge of scientific discovery over the past 15 years. And I think the answer is that there's a huge gap between what we now know scientifically and how these issues are handled on the ground in terms of policies. And that's definitely true with regard to both fire and post-fire logging. Most fires, the great majority of fires, are suppressed right after they start, which is the only time they actually can be suppressed. So again, you've got a lightning strike, and it's usually associated with some summer rain. The fire is just barely creeping along. It's maybe a quarter of an acre in size. Very easy to suppress that. The great majority of those fires are suppressed, which scientists are almost universally saying now is a very, very bad idea. We need more fire in our forests, and we should not be suppressing those. But that practice continues. In addition, the majority of the money that's spent on fire suppression is spent trying to suppress fires that get larger and are moving faster under high fire weather, hot, dry, windy conditions. And the great myth about that is that we know now scientifically that it is simply not possible to stop a weather-driven fire. And yet we're spending billions of dollars every year and putting firefighters' lives unnecessarily at risk trying to stop these weather-driven fires in these backcountry areas when it's impossible. It's no more possible to stop a weather-driven forest fire than it is possible to stand on a ridge and fight the wind. And it's quite literally the same thing. And yet that's what continues. And so what scientists, myself included, are urging Congress, policymakers at the state and federal level, to do is to allow more backcountry fires to burn, especially when they're started by lightning, and focus our resources on protecting homes, protecting communities in rural areas of this country where homes and communities are adjacent to forests or other fire-adapted vegetation communities, because we know we can do that effectively. And that's really what we're not putting our resources primarily on right now. And so, right now we're spending most of the resources on these ill-advised and destructive backcountry logging projects, most of which are done under the guise of fire management or fire risk reduction or ecological restoration. And we talked about those euphemisms earlier that are being used in the Westerman bill. That's what we're seeing right now is, the same old logging that we saw in the 1980s, including clear cuts, but it's all being called and packaged as, ecological restoration or fire management and things like that. That's where a lot
So
of
very simply, I mean, you're suggesting that we should let fire be fire, let nature take its course, that there are many benefits that are applied to that, and yet have an envelopment or a barrier or encourage different types of construction that would protect homes, but let the process that nature has begun to unwind, let it run its course.
Yeah, that's very well said. That's exactly right. We really need to prioritize home protection because here's what we know, and the science is telling us this loudly and clearly. If homeowners do defensible space work within 60 feet of the homes, and by that I mean removing most of the shrubs and small trees and removing the lower limbs on the mature trees, but leaving those mature trees intact. If you do that defensible space work within 60 feet of homes, and you reduce the combustibility of the home itself, make the home more fire safe, fire-resistant roofing, rain gutter guards to prevent those pine needles from accumulating in the rain gutters, exterior vents that have a wire mesh that's sufficiently fine so a flaming ember won't float along in the wind and float into an attic. Simple, practical things that people can do. If that's done properly, over 95% of homes will survive a fire, even if it goes right through the town and keeps going onto the other side. Over 95% will survive. And the science is clear on that. And so we know it's effective, but that's not where most of our resources are going.
Interesting. Now, when you talked about the logging industry, are we talking about this in the context of these fires where the loggers then can come in and take this post-fire forest and begin to cut it down? Or are we talking about just whenever they want to go in, irrespective of whether there's been a fire or not?
It's both. If these logging bills pass, the logging companies would be able to go in and log these areas on our national forests, these massive, massive logging projects, whether it's after a fire or whether it's a forest that hasn't burned in decades. It could be a mature, old-growth forest even. And these logging projects could go forward. Not only that, these bills would prevent the federal courts from issuing injunctions to stop logging projects even where they were found to violate other laws, such as the Endangered Species Act or the Clean Water Act.
Wait, that seems totally unreal. I mean, that in fact those laws, which are so important to our foundation as a cleaner society, that those can just be ignored in this process?
That's right. That's what these laws, these bills, these logging bills would do if they were passed. And the Trump administration officials have already said they support them. But there's a lot of opposition, a lot of people trying to stop them. My organization included. The John Muir project of Earth Island Institute. We're really working hard to try to stop these logging bills. But if they passed, there would not only be an almost complete elimination of environmental analysis and public participation, but you couldn't even go to the courts to stop a logging project that was documented to be illegal.
That is remarkable. I would imagine it's going to get a lot of pushback.
Well, I think it is, and one of the difficulties is because they have packaged these logging bills so deceptively that then of course organizations like mine we have to go around and explain to policymakers and even to reporters in some cases that these are really just big smokescreens for a massive commercial logging effort, and these are about the most anti-environmental things that could possibly be imagined on our national forests. But that's the work that has to be done. But I think that once people realize that there is this effort to deceive, I think that the opposition becomes stronger.
I know that there are many benefits to wildfire. I think somebody listening to our podcast today might ask the question, but does it do damage? I mean, there are many species who don't want to be in the way of a fire. There are many animals and others who may be lost in that process. What do you say about that?
Well, it's a really good question. I think, this is one of the things I love about this field, this unusual field of forest and fire ecology, because in a way, it's like opposite world. Everything we discover, just about everything, is seemingly counterintuitive, at least at first glance. And so, we thought for many, many decades, generations, that fires destroy forests. Not so. They're really important. They're actually restorative and rejuvenating forces in forests. One of the things that we also thought was that forest fires move really, really quickly, and they must kill millions and millions of animals every time that a fire burns. Well, it turns out we now have really good technology. We can actually track how fast fires burn every single day, and we have these fire progression maps, and it turns out that forest fires move very, very slowly, much more slowly than we thought. Even when they're being pushed by hot, dry, windy conditions, and even when they're burning in the crowns, they move much more slowly than people realize. So about the fastest rate of spread that you'll find on the fastest days that a given fire burns, it's about 1 or 2 miles per hour. And even that's pretty unusual. Usually it's a tiny fraction of 1 mile per hour. And so basically animals have evolved over many, many millennia to be able to respond to fire. Small mammals just go into their burrows. The heat from an intense patch of fire can go upwards 200 or 300 feet, but it only goes downward a few inches. And so the fire passes over that area in a matter of minutes, and the animals are fine. Some animals go into large down logs until the fire passes. Birds just fly out of the way, circle back, and then just come right back to those areas after the flames pass. And there are always a small number of animals that die in forest fires. There's no question about that. Sometimes it's from smoke inhalation or they get trapped in a box canyon somewhere. But that's very much the exception, not the rule. And so mostly these animals just simply, they don't even have to run. They just walk out of the way or burrow into the ground, and then they just come back as soon as the fire's passed.
How much money is involved, aside from the interests of the loggers? Right now, with the suppression techniques that we are undertaking as a society, I'm reading where the federal government is actually running out of money to fight various fires across the nation. And so is there a money component to all of this where somebody's going to ask whether this is still good policy or still in the vanguard of what ecologists are saying? Is anybody asking that? We could save money by letting it run its natural course.
That's exactly right, and that's what the scientists are saying. The scientists are saying this is the way to go ecologically. We need to let more fires burn in more remote forests, and we need to focus fire suppression activities and defensible space work right at the homes. From an economic standpoint, there are also people that are starting to raise that as well, because the fact is if we let more backcountry fires burn, then we wouldn't be spending hundreds of millions of dollars every year trying to fight those backcountry fires, which is ill-advised ecologically and is a really bad idea economically as well. So I think that they're actually the two things, economics and ecology, actually dovetail. Right now, unfortunately, the proposals in all of these logging bills, they all contain provisions to basically double down on fire suppression. They would basically at least double the current expenditures on fire suppression with no limits whatsoever. So in other words, no system of prioritizing protection of homes. And so we know what that would lead to. It would lead to just even more backcountry fire suppression activities.
I want you to comment on this, and then we'll close up with you telling people what they should do when they hear about this great resiliency bill that we've been talking about. But I'm reading in the Daily Beast that a combination of increasingly larger fires, and they underline increasingly larger fires, and I don't know that I've often seen that. That's actually, I guess, to get people to go to another place to look for information. But a combination of increasingly larger fires and higher firefighter and equipment costs mean that the budget for wildfires goes up, while the total amount of money given to the Forest Service stays the same. Now, I would imagine that a lot of the other practices and things that we rely upon the Forest Service for are extremely important, and yet they're beginning to get crowded out by how much we're spending on fires.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We have numerous programs in these federal agencies that have nothing to do with fire suppression or logging, and they're important. We have recreation programs, which are incredibly important for local economies, and there are programs that deal with protecting wildlife habitat and other things. And those programs generally don't have enough money. And what mostly the money is being spent on is logging and backcountry fire suppression. And so instead of asking Congress for even more money, which would just go to more backcountry fire suppression, the Forest Service has all the money it needs with the existing levels of funding if it just stops spending most of the money on backcountry logging and fire suppression. The agency has more than enough money. And so, this concern about borrowing money during fire suppression operations from other budget line items, that obviously is a concern, but it's only a problem because they're doing all this backcountry fire suppression, which they shouldn't be doing.
Are you worried that you may lose a bit of support from people who do love to use our national parks, but may have read that recently winds have wreaked havoc on various wildfires that are threatening, for example, two crown jewels of the National Park Service, and I'm talking about Glacier and Yosemite National Parks. Are you worried that there are going to be people saying, wait a minute, I love to visit, and I want to make certain that whatever resources are necessary to protect these icons are going to be spent?
Well, it's a great question. It's one of our big challenges, which is really just a public education challenge. If you look at the 1988 Yellowstone fires, those were thought to be this enormous disaster at the time. About 1.5 million acres burned. It was a nice mix of intensities, but a lot of it was high intensity. And people thought at the time, the Yellowstone National Park, this national treasure, has been destroyed. Well, it was just months later after the fires that all the wildflowers started blooming, and the new conifer seedlings began to sprout, and the aspens and elk populations started benefiting, and all these birds that people hadn't seen very much in a long time started showing up, and you had this wonderful, rich, colorful ecosystem that developed there in this post-fire habitat. Well, now the Park Service gives guided tours. It's actually a tourist attraction to go and tour these burn areas that burned in the Yellowstone fires because, of course, it's national parks and they're protected, so they weren't post-fire logged. And so we get to see how these systems operate naturally on their own if logging's not part of the equation. And so I think that the same thing will be true of Glacier National Park. Those forests are all very, very strongly dependent on fire. They naturally have a mixed or even high-intensity fire regime, depending on the forest type. In fact, some of those tree species can't even effectively reproduce without high-intensity fire. They need intense fire to melt the resins that hold the seeds in the cones and to release those seeds so they can actually germinate and reproduce. In Yosemite National Park, we have a fire that actually is burning right on the edge of a giant sequoia grove. And I think people have been scared about fire burning into these sequoia groves for a long time. We love our giant sequoias, and they're wonderful, iconic tree species. Well, it turns out what the research is telling us is that giant sequoias, just like that species I mentioned in the northern Rockies, they depend on fire, and especially more intense fire, to effectively reproduce. They have that same circumstance where they need the fire to melt the resins in the cones to release the seeds and to consume most of the, what we call duff and litter on the forest floor, and to create this really nutrient-rich bed of ash that allows the seeds to germinate and the new sequoia seedlings to regenerate. Most of these giant sequoia groves haven't burned in a century. And if you go into these areas, which I have in over the years, what you'll see is these big old giant sequoias, but almost no young ones. That's because we've been keeping fire out for 100 years. We've been loving them to death, in a sense. And the truth is that these fires are the best thing that can possibly happen for these giant sequoia groves.
Dr. Chad Hanson, it has been a privilege to have you on today, a forest fire ecologist from the John Muir Earth Island Institute. And to tell us if people want to keep an eye on the Resilient Forest Act of 2017, what they should be doing to really heed your warnings today about the impact of this legislation.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so first they can contact us at www.johnmuirproject.org. All of our contact information is on our website for the John Muir Project. Second, they can call the Capitol Switchboard, which is area code 202-224-3121, and ask to be transferred to their congressional representative and their U.S. senators, and ask them to oppose all of these logging bills. Ask them to oppose H.R. 2936, ask them to oppose S-1731, and there's another logging bill that was just introduced 4 days ago by Republican Congressman from Oregon, Greg Walden, that would essentially do the same thing but in forests in Oregon, and that is H.R. 3715. Please urge your members of Congress to oppose all these logging bills or any versions of them, and urge them to protect our national forests and take measures to increase protections, not decrease them.
I thank you so much for joining us today on AmericaTrendsPodcast.com. You've been a great resource.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
If you like this episode, please leave us a kind rating or review. I'm on my hands and knees. Please do it on iTunes because your review is really critical for us to continue providing this podcast. And John, I know that iTunes looks at this. They want to make certain that we have some rankings, some visibility, and that we're getting some traffic, and then they give you better positioning.
Absolutely. And this way it'll put us in the forefront so you can find us much easier on your iPhone or Android, whatever you may be using.
And they may even send you out an alert. So please, if you can, don't miss a single episode of America Trends Podcast. And, John, they can subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher.com.
And also subscribe on our website.
Oh, absolutely.
We send out a little blurb, and we can also take your emails there at newsletter@rifkinradio.com. That's another way to get us.
And we do not sell or share
No
our lists.
spamming, nothing.
Well, I don't know. Does anybody want our lists? I don't know, but we don't do it.
Good question.
Even if they asked us.
Even
Nobody's
if they
asked
asked
us.
us.
But.
Right.
And when you do subscribe, let us know on Facebook and Twitter. We're getting very active on Facebook and Twitter. Our handle on both platforms, and John, this is really easy, at Trends Podcast. That's it.
That's real easy.
You like that? Did you get that?
I got that.
Okay.
I'm going to have to
gonna
check
give you
it
a
out
quiz.
now. I'm going to have to twit it.
We want to thank you, of course, personally for subscribing. And we also would like to get some of your ideas and questions for future episodes of America Trends Podcast. And that's important, too, because we're all over the map. Our interest editorially in the future, John, has no bounds. But we want to know what it is that you'd like to hear from us. If there was a segment that you'd like to see us follow up on, or if there's something in depth that you'd like us to deal with, please let us know that, too.
We're looking at the future. There's so much we can look at.
Yeah, and the topics that we've dealt with, I mean, we have gotten such incredible guests over the recent period, but they're only going to come to us if they know we've got an engaged and interactive audience.
Absolutely.
So it's really important that you become part of this podcast in so many different ways that we're sharing with you today.
You're absolutely right. We need your support and your help and your reviews.
And your ideas.
And ideas.
Or questions on Facebook and Twitter. And by the way, you can direct message us at Trends Podcast or using the hashtag Trends Podcast. You can also add an email address if you have a public one that you'd like us to give out.
Yeah, good. Hey, and you know what? We didn't mention Amazon.
Oh, yes. We have an Amazon store.
Yes.
And so if you go up, you don't have to buy the things that might be highlighted at that particular time. You can buy any book, and there's some benefit that comes back
Just
to
put
us.
what you're looking at in the little search engine block there, and it'll take you right to Amazon, and it'll help us out.
Absolutely. And it doesn't really cost you anything more because they have built that into their pricing structure. So we get a little taste and you get more programming like this and you get the item that you were looking for. So it works for all of us.
It's a win-win.
Absolutely. Win-win-win.
Win-win-win.
So for more information on America Trends and for the latest updates on upcoming episodes, be sure to like our page on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. You can find us at Trends Podcast. And again, you can find John and I here in our studio performing as best we can for you.
That's right.
And
Let us
making
out.
What's that? They're not going to let us out. No one is. Hey, listen, thank you so much for joining us today on America Trends. We'll see you next time.
We hope to hear from you soon.
Oh, by the way, we are posting all the time. And we're posting on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Good point.
So just be aware, if you're looking for new episodes, they're coming on Tuesdays and Thursdays. When you wake up, before you go out on your jog or your walk and you want to take us with you, we'll be there for you.
Very good.
All right. Have a great day.